Hello, everyone. I'd like to just review the Gustafson study questions. And just a note, I send out a lot of videos. Watching them is optional, for sure. On the other hand, as you're preparing to write your essays, your last essays, and especially as you're preparing to take the final exam, I would recommend watching these videos. I would recommend watching all the videos in terms of, they're supposed to be helpful in terms of clarifying your grasp of these texts. So there's a lot of videos for this course. It might be ridiculous to review them all, but I think you should be making use of them, to whatever extent they help. And if they're not helping, then you should let me know and I'll change my approach. But anyway, okay, here's the Gustafson study questions, what I had in mind when I asked the questions. Number one, Gustafson's first example of a definition of grief. This is in the beginning of the essay. This is not his, the one that he's proposing. But his first example of a definition of grief appears on page 458. Quote, as a first approximation, grief might be something like a deep unhappiness, essentially tied to a belief or judgment that someone has died. Sounds very plausible, very basic definition of what grief is. How does this definition differ from Gustafson's definition G? Well, it differs in form for sure, but the really important difference is that this definition doesn't have the desire component, which is the big idea in Gustafson's definition. It has two components. This first one has the feeling, the deep unhappiness, and the cognitive element, the belief or judgment that someone has died, but it doesn't include the desire that they be alive or the desire that they not have died. So that's a big difference, and that I wanted to highlight that because so much of what Gustafson is getting across is this conflict between our desires and our belief when it comes to being in a state of grief. Number two, what does Gustafson mean by a belief contrary desire? So a belief contrary desire would be a belief, not a belief. It would be a desire that is contrary to belief. It can be tricky. So we're talking about a belief contrary desire. The actual thing is a desire, and the belief contrary is a way of describing this particular kind of desire. So a desire that's not belief contrary would be a desire that is something that is in line with your beliefs insofar as it's a desire for something that you think is possible to achieve, whereas a belief contrary desire, and belief contrary is the adjective there, right? Belief contrary desire would be a desire for something that because of what you believe, one of your beliefs, that it cannot actually be satisfied. Just a sec. Sorry for the interruption. I heard something. Number two, a belief contrary desire is a desire for something that that you cannot actually ever achieve or satisfy. Number three, much of Gustafson's point depends on there being a real distinction between desire and wish. What is this purported distinction? And do you yourself think there is a difference between desiring something and wishing for something? Obviously, a two-part question. The first part's pretty definite. The second is open-ended. Ask for your opinion. The way that Gustafson distinguishes between a desire and a wish, I think, is that he says at a certain point that a desire is something which is action prompting, whereas a wish is not. A full-blown desire is one that primes you or that motivates you to actually do something to fulfill the desire. Whereas a wish is, as we say, an idle wish. It's something that you wish were true, but it's not something that actually really motivates you to go out and try to do something to achieve the object of the wish. That is, I think, he may distinguish them in other ways, but I think that that's the important thing. Is there a real difference between desiring something and wishing for something? Again, that's up to you, but I think that is, if anything, the kind of weakest point in his argument. As I've talked to students over the years discussing this point in this essay, many of them have challenged the idea that there really is an important difference between desiring something and wishing for something. Is it on the matter of, are they the same thing, but a desire is stronger? Is a desire something entirely different from a wish? It's really not clear from Gustafson's essay, yet it is a completely essential point. Because for Gustafson, if we have the other components of grief, the belief that someone has died, the feeling of unhappiness, and merely a wish that they still be alive, we're not really grieving. Whereas if we have the two other components and a desire that they still be alive, then we are grieving. So I don't know what the answer to it is, but it's very important for Gustafson's argument. Number 4, what does it mean for a desire to be irrational? What I was really getting at there was a desire is a desire. I mean, it's something that you want. So looked at completely in isolation, just for what it is, I don't think there can be an irrational desire. Desires only become irrational in the context of how they relate to our beliefs. And a desire can be irrational only if in some way or another it conflicts with belief. The most obvious conflict being in the definition G, in that if a desire is for something that you know to be impossible, then it's an irrational desire. Certainly, if you desire something which is impossible, but you don't know that it's impossible, all things being equal, that is not irrational. It's once we actually know or believe something to be impossible, and yet we still desire it, that's when the desire becomes irrational. There is some suggestion also, just to qualify a little bit in the essay, that desires can be irrational if they are, let's say, stronger. Like if you have a what does he say? If you have a strong desire that all cats should die, that's an irrational desire. If it's something that is utterly sort of out of proportion, if you have a burning desire that everybody stops wearing the color blue, it's an irrational desire. Maybe you don't like blue and you're like, well, I wish people would stop wearing blue. That would make sense. But if you have a burning desire keeping you up at night, then there's something wrong with that too. So maybe a desire can be irrational in more than one way. But in terms of the definition G, clearly if you desire something which you know to be impossible, that's an irrational desire. Number 5, given Gustafson's definition of grief, G, and G is just his name for the definition of grief, and it should be something you should essentially memorize. It's a short definition. Given Gustafson's definition of grief, what implications does it have for the, quote, grieving process? Especially, what does it suggest about how grief is actually resolved? I don't know if this is something that he actually treats in the essay. It certainly doesn't treat it in any extended way, but I think he may suggest that the paper's not really about the grieving process, the different stages of grief, if there are any. I mean, that's the Kubler-Ross idea, okay? It's not obviously true. It may be true, but the idea that grieving is a process is, how we've come to think of grief, but, in a popular sense, but something that needs to be examined. Especially, what does it suggest about how grief is actually resolved? Well, first of all, grief may never be resolved, okay? I mean, I'm not saying particular instances of grief don't resolve themselves, but I think the truth of the matter is that sometimes they don't. Sometimes people grieve for the rest of their lives. I think that's simply true. Not everybody and not commonly, but people do. So that's another thing that I think that you can't take for granted, that grief actually, in all cases, does resolve itself. I don't think it does. But how could grief resolve itself? I think the answer to that is pretty clear, at least by implication. Grief resolves itself in terms of the definition G when the desire component is no longer there. It may be that the desire kind of changes into a mere wish. I wish that so and so were still alive, but I don't have this active, action prompting desire. That maybe that's how it might resolve itself. I think that's the logical implication of the definition G.